On March 14, 2024, 52-year-old Nadia Vatels was found dead, her body stuffed into a duffel bag in her own apartment in the bustling neighborhood of Kips Bay, Manhattan. What should have been a peaceful evening turned into an unimaginable nightmare. How did this woman, who had called this apartment her home for years, end up in such a horrific and degrading position? The shocking details of what happened behind those closed doors would send shockwaves through her family, her community, and the entire city of New York. Authorities were left with one burning question: who would commit such a brutal act, and what could have driven them to such extremes? This wasn't a random act of violence, nor a simple case of robbery gone wrong. The truth surrounding Nadia's death is more disturbing than anyone could have anticipated. Who were the people responsible for her death? How had they gained access to her apartment? What happened in those final moments of Nadia's life? Stay with us, because the answers will not only disturb you, they will make you question everything you thought you knew about safety, trust, and human nature. The chilling truth behind Nadia Vatels' death is more complex than it first appears, and it is only now, piece by piece, that it is coming to light. The story you are about to hear is one of deception, violence, and a hidden side of New York City that you won't want to miss. Stick with us, because the truth behind Nadia's death will leave you speechless. Nadia Vatels, a 52-year-old woman, was an unassuming figure in her tight-knit neighborhood. She worked quietly, lived alone, and had few interactions with the public. Yet her life had been filled with enough love and care to make her death all the more tragic. In fact, she was well loved by her family, who described her as warm and dependable. On the surface, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. She lived in a modest, yet well-kept apartment in Kips Bay, a neighborhood that was generally safe and inviting. Those who knew her described her as an ordinary woman with a passion for the simple things in life: a good book, a hot cup of coffee, and the quiet joys of living in one of the most iconic cities in the world. But on March 14, 2024, that ordinary life came to a tragic and brutal end. Her family, growing concerned after not hearing from her for a few days, reached out to the building superintendent for a wellness check. It was not uncommon for Nadia to spend a day or two in her apartment without contacting anyone, but days of silence were a red flag. What happened when the superintendent unlocked the door is a scene that will stay with everyone who witnessed it. Nadia's body was found in her apartment, not lying peacefully in her bed, but stuffed into a duffel bag, her life violently ripped away. It would soon become clear that this wasn't a simple death. Nadia had died in the most horrific manner, her body showing signs of severe trauma. Her injuries were so extensive that the medical examiner immediately ruled it a homicide. When the building superintendent entered the apartment, what he found left him speechless. Nadia's lifeless body was discovered in the corner of her bedroom, contorted and stuffed into a large black duffel bag. The bag had been carefully hidden, tucked in a place where no one would easily stumble upon it. The scene that unfolded next would shock everyone. The autopsy later confirmed what many had feared: Nadia had suffered brutal and extensive injuries. She had multiple facial fractures, a brain bleed, 2 broken ribs, and blunt force trauma to the head. The injuries were consistent with a violent struggle. This was no accident. As the investigation unfolded, it became apparent that Nadia had been attacked with an extreme level of force. But what was most chilling of all was the realization that this violence may not have been random. According to the New York Police Department's chief of detectives, there was something even more disturbing at play. It appears that some squatters had taken over her apartment, he said. We believe Nadia came home and upon entering her apartment, walked in on the squatters who were there. The idea of squatters invading an apartment in one of New York's most prestigious neighborhoods seemed unbelievable. Nadia had been a resident of Kips Bay for years, and her apartment should have been one of the safest places for her. But it wasn't just the fact that her apartment had been overtaken that made this case so shocking. It was the brutal nature of the crime. Nadia had walked into an unimaginable nightmare, one that would claim her life within minutes. As police began to piece together the evidence, they soon realized the squatters were no strangers to the area. The NYPD began searching for 2 individuals who had recently been seen around the building. Howie Tejada, 19, and Kensley Alston, 18, were both known to have a history of living in vacant apartments. The investigation would take a twist when it was revealed that Tejada and Alston had been living in Nadia's apartment for some time. It wasn't clear whether they had planned to rob her or simply decided to take over the space. What was clear, however, was that when Nadia returned to her apartment, she encountered them, an encounter that would ultimately lead to her death. The NYPD quickly turned to surveillance footage, witness statements, and forensics to track down the suspects. But by then, Tejada and Alston had already fled the city. Authorities issued a nationwide manhunt, with the U.S. Marshals joining the search. Days passed without a lead, but investigators were determined. They knew the suspects were on the run, but they had no idea where they were heading. On March 22nd, just over a week after Nadia's body was discovered, U.S. Marshals tracked Tejada and Alston to a location in York, Pennsylvania, just west of Philadelphia. After a tense standoff, both suspects were taken into custody. The arrest marked the beginning of a long and emotional journey for Nadia's family, who had been left in limbo, wondering what had happened to their loved one. But the arrest was just the beginning. As Tejada and Alston were questioned, the details of the crime began to emerge. Through their confessions, investigators learned how they had taken over Nadia's apartment and the chilling events that led to her brutal death. What had been meant to be a crime of opportunity quickly escalated into a violent, tragic act. Stay tuned as we dive deeper into the investigation and the motivations behind this shocking crime. What drove Tejada and Alston to murder Nadia Vitels? What went wrong in those final moments before Nadia's life was taken from her? We'll reveal the chilling answers next. The NYPD quickly identified two suspects, 19-year-old Hallie Tejada and 18-year-old Kensley Alston. But as investigators scoured Manhattan for any trace of the pair, it became apparent that these individuals were not only elusive, but had vanished without a trace. Tejada and Alston weren't strangers to crime. Both had histories that suggested they were capable of much more than petty theft. Their motives were unclear, but one thing was certain. They had been in Nadia Vitels' apartment when her life was violently taken. After Nadia's body was found, the case began to unfold with disturbing speed. Detectives were piecing together a story of desperation, opportunism, and fear. A series of surveillance videos from nearby buildings confirmed that Tejada and Alston had been in and around Nadia's apartment complex in the days leading up to her death. But there was a chilling question that hung in the air. Why was Nadia targeted? It wasn't long before investigators pieced together that Tejada and Alston had been squatting in Nadia's apartment. Their reasons for being there were murky, whether out of necessity, a misguided sense of entitlement, or something more sinister, but the apartment had become their refuge. Nadia, however, had no idea they were there. On the night of March 14th, Nadia arrived home after a long day, unsuspecting. It's believed that as she opened the door to her apartment, she was confronted by the two squatters who had taken refuge in her space. This moment of violence spiraled quickly into an attack, and before Nadia could even fully comprehend what was happening, her life was over. The brutality of the murder left detectives and medical examiners stunned. Nadia had suffered multiple facial fractures, a brain bleed, broken ribs, and blunt force trauma to the head. It wasn't just a crime of passion. It was a calculated, merciless attack. But then, after the crime, Tejada and Alston vanished, leaving behind no clues except for a few broken windows and an apartment that would forever bear the scars of their presence. As the investigation ramped up, police reached out to the public for help, but Tejada and Alston were ghosts. They had no fixed addresses, no reliable means of communication, and certainly no intention of returning to New York anytime soon. The question now wasn't whether they were guilty. Everyone was certain of that. It was whether they would ever be found. Detectives worked tirelessly, scanning phone records, checking bus and train station footage, and even examining credit card transactions. There were whispers that the two had fled the city, and soon enough, the trail went cold. For days, there was nothing. No new leads, no sightings, just silence. Then, suddenly, a breakthrough. The U.S. Marshals, who had been collaborating with the NYPD, managed to track down the pair across state lines. They had fled to York, Pennsylvania, west of Philadelphia, far from the eyes of the city they had terrorized. But how had they managed to escape? How had they evaded capture for so long? Authorities speculated that they had been hiding out in a network of abandoned houses, living off the grid and relying on a network of people who had helped them vanish. The possibility of this case becoming yet another unsolved mystery in the annals of true crime seemed imminent. But now, the clock was ticking. As the hunt for Tejada and Alston intensified, the city of New York held its breath. Was this the end of the story? Or was there still a chance for justice? Would they be captured in time, or would they manage to slip through the cracks of the system once again? The question weighed heavily on everyone involved. Would Tejada and Alston be forced to face their horrifying crime, or would they walk away scot-free, hiding in plain sight? Stay tuned, because the most shocking part of this case is still to come. The hunt for Hallie Tejada and Kensley Alston had been a race against time. As the days passed, the NYPD and U.S. Marshals intensively pursued leads that could help them locate the two suspects who had seemingly disappeared into thin air. Meanwhile, the questions surrounding Nadia Vittle's brutal murder only grew more complex. Then, on March 22, 2024, just over a week after Nadia's body was discovered, investigators caught a break. U.S. Marshals tracked down Tejada and Alston to a small town in York, Pennsylvania, situated west of Philadelphia. It was a quiet suburban area far from the chaos of New York City, and the fact that the suspects had fled across state lines only deepened the mystery surrounding their motives. How did these young individuals, Tejada just 19 and Alston only 18, end up so far from the scene of the crime? Were they trying to start fresh, or had they planned their escape? The questions were mounting, but law enforcement was determined to get answers. When U.S. Marshals finally arrived at the location where Tejada and Alston were hiding, they were arrested without incident. The moment was tense, but there was no resistance from the suspects. Their capture seemed to bring a sense of relief to everyone involved in the investigation. But it was clear that many pieces of the puzzle still needed to be put together. As Tejada and Alston were taken into custody, their faces were blank, void of any visible remorse. The detectives couldn't help but wonder, what was going through their minds? In the aftermath of the arrest, the question on everyone's mind was, why Nadia? What had led these two young individuals, who seemed to have no previous connection to her, to commit such a heinous act? The authorities were quick to point out that Tejada and Alston had been squatting in Nadia's apartment for several weeks. They had found themselves in a vulnerable situation, possibly desperate for a place to stay. But that still didn't explain the violence that had been inflicted upon Nadia. There had to be more to this story than just a simple robbery gone wrong. As they delved deeper into the suspects' backgrounds, investigators uncovered a troubling truth. Neither of the two had any significant personal connection to Nadia Vittles, but both appeared to have been living in a state of desperation. Hallie Tejada, who had been living with friends and bouncing between temporary living situations, had found herself without a permanent place to stay. Kensley Alston, just 18, had a criminal history of petty theft and minor offenses, but nothing that would have warranted the violent outburst that led to Nadia's death. What, then, had pushed them to this extreme? Authorities began to speculate that Nadia had unknowingly walked into a dangerous situation when she arrived home that evening. In an attempt to confront the squatters, Nadia may have become a target of their aggression, perhaps because they feared being caught, or because they saw her as an obstacle to their escape. Some experts suggested it was a crime of opportunity. The two squatters had likely been living in Nadia's apartment without her knowledge for weeks, perhaps feeling a sense of ownership or entitlement. Nadia's arrival at the apartment may have been the catalyst for violence, an act of fear and desperation, as Tejada and Alston knew they couldn't afford to be caught. The question remained, did they even think they could get away with it? Were they motivated purely by survival, or did the crime escalate due to a deeper rage? In the weeks following their arrest, both Tejada and Alston remained tight-lipped. They refused to speak to authorities without legal counsel present, which only intensified the mystery surrounding their actions. Were they simply two young people who made a terrible, violent mistake? Or was there something darker at play? Investigators combed through their social media profiles, phone records, and personal history, searching for any clues that might explain their motivations. What they found painted a picture of two individuals who, while facing hardship and neglect, had been living on the edge of society. But the true motive remained elusive. Was this a spur-of-the-moment decision driven by fear of being caught squatting? Or was there something about Nadia herself, something her family, friends, or even the police hadn't yet uncovered, that led to her brutal murder? As the arrest made headlines across the country, the public was left to grapple with these disturbing questions. Was this simply an act of desperation gone horribly wrong? Or was there something more to the story, something that had yet to come to light? In the wake of Tejada and Alston's arrests, A wave of questions flooded the media and the public's mind. How would these two young suspects be tried? And most chilling of all, what was the true nature of the crime they had committed? As the investigation continued, it was clear that the pieces of this unsettling puzzle were only beginning to fit together. The answers were coming, but they would not come easily. Hallie Tejada and Kensley Alston were both young, barely out of their teens, with complicated and often troubling backgrounds. Their histories were marked by run-ins with the law, unstable living situations, and a lack of direction. But it wasn't until their arrest in March 2024 that the true depth of their connection to each other and to Nadia Vitel's began to surface. Tejada, at just 19 years old, had been living a transient life, moving from place to place, struggling to find stability. Born into a family of modest means, her upbringing was far from ideal. As a teenager, she had been in and out of the foster care system, facing emotional trauma and neglect. By the time she met Kensley Alston, Tejada had already been exposed to a world of crime and desperation. Kensley, similarly, had a difficult past. Raised in a rough neighborhood in Brooklyn, he was no stranger to hardship. At just 18, Alston was already known for his aggressive tendencies and involvement in petty crimes. Their paths crossed in the city, and they quickly became inseparable. In the weeks leading up to Nadia's murder, Tejada and Alston found themselves in a precarious situation. They were homeless, struggling to find a place to stay, and the streets of Manhattan were a constant source of anxiety and fear. But everything changed when they discovered the apartment in Kips Bay. Nadia Vitel's apartment, with its locked doors and quiet, seemingly uninhabited space, became a temporary refuge for the two young squatters. The question that haunted investigators was simple: why Nadia? Were Tejada and Alston just trying to survive, or was there something deeper, something darker that had driven them to murder? The idea of taking over an apartment, finding a new place to call their own, seemed plausible. The apartment was a perfect target, vacant for long stretches of time with little to no security in place. Nadia, who lived alone, might have seemed like an easy target for the pair to claim the space as their own. But there were other theories circulating. Some believed that the murder was an impulsive crime of opportunity, that Nadia had simply walked in on the squatters in the middle of a confrontation. There was no clear evidence that Nadia had known her attackers personally, but the brutality of the crime suggested something more than just a random act of violence. Could it be that Tejada and Alston had prior knowledge of Nadia's apartment? Or had they just stumbled upon it by chance? The truth seemed to lie somewhere in the middle. While there were signs that Tejada and Alston had likely planned to stay in the apartment for a while, the escalation of violence on that fateful night suggested that something went terribly wrong when Nadia returned home. It's still unclear whether the squatters were simply looking for shelter or whether there was a more sinister motive at play. Had Nadia disturbed their plan to take over the apartment? Or was the murder simply a result of a brief encounter that spiraled out of control? The question that lingered long after their arrest was, what did they truly hope to gain by murdering Nadia? Was it a crime of survival, or was there something even darker in their motivations? The more investigators dug into the lives of Tejada and Alston, the more it seemed that this was a crime born of desperation, but with echoes of something much more calculated lurking underneath. As the investigation continued to unfold, it became clear that Tejada and Alston had more to hide than they were willing to admit. Their motives, while unclear, painted a picture of two young individuals caught in a dangerous spiral of poor decisions and a moment of violence that could have been prevented. However, that was a question only they could answer. Would they confess the full story, or would the truth remain buried, lost in the shadows of their troubled lives? The answers would come with time, but one thing was certain. Nadia Vitel's tragic death was a stark reminder of how far desperation can drive a person to cross the line between survival and murder. The investigation now turned toward the final pieces of this horrific puzzle as the authorities tried to understand just how Nadia became a victim of two young lives filled with brokenness, rage, and a hunger for something they could never fully grasp. Following Hallie Tejada and Kensley Alston's arrest, the investigation took a darker turn. As detectives dug deeper into their pasts, they began to uncover a disturbing pattern of behavior that hinted at a far larger and more complex situation than initially understood. The truth about these two young suspects was far more chilling than anyone had imagined. Hallie Tejada, despite her tender age, had already accumulated a history of trouble. Before her arrest, she had been arrested several times on charges ranging from petty theft to vandalism, though most of the charges had been dismissed or resulted in minimal consequences. As a child, she had been bounced between foster homes, which left her with deep-rooted emotional scars. Growing up in the foster care system had left her with a profound sense of distrust and resentment toward authority. This distrust often manifested in impulsive, reckless behavior that put her in dangerous situations. However, her decision to squat in Nadia Vitel's apartment wasn't born out of simple need. It was fueled by something darker. Kensley Alston, on the other hand, had a history of violence and aggression. He was known to have been involved in several street brawls and had previously been arrested for assault. His criminal tendencies were well established long before the murder. Raised in one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in Brooklyn, Kensley had learned early on to survive by any means necessary, often relying on his strength and intimidation to get what he wanted. Despite his young age, Alston had already earned a reputation as a troublemaker, often seen with a gang of friends who encouraged his volatile behavior. The relationship between Tejada and Alston was more than just one of survival. It was one of mutual destruction. Both had found a way to feed off each other's need for instability, and it seemed that the more dangerous their actions became, the more they drew together. But it was Nadia's apartment, with its quiet, seemingly unoccupied space, that offered them what they thought was an escape from their chaotic lives. The police soon discovered that the pair had been living in Nadia's apartment for days before the murder. While Nadia had been away, they made themselves at home, eating her food, rifling through her personal belongings, and ultimately deciding to make the apartment their own. This was no longer just about surviving. They had taken the apartment as a symbol of ownership, a place where they could stay undisturbed. Then, on March 14th, Nadia returned home. What happened next was both brutal and calculated. Nadia must have been caught off guard the moment she walked through her door. The two squatters, likely aware of her absence for days, didn't expect her to return when she did. As soon as Nadia entered her apartment, she was confronted. The ensuing struggle would end her life. The medical examiner would later confirm that Nadia had suffered multiple facial fractures, broken ribs, a brain bleed, and blunt force trauma to the head, injuries that suggested not just a fight for survival, but an act of violence driven by fear and panic. What remained unclear was what the suspects planned to do after Nadia's death. Were they hoping to take over her apartment permanently? Had they been planning to steal her belongings, or was this simply a crime of opportunity? In the aftermath of the murder, Hallie Tejada and Kensley Alston fled the scene, leaving behind the apartment they had briefly called home. As investigators continued to dig into their pasts, more unsettling information began to emerge. Both suspects had a long history of drifting from place to place, avoiding stable work, and using petty crimes to get by. But what struck detectives the most was the pattern of escalation. They hadn't just committed a crime out of desperation. No, their actions suggested a pattern of growing violence. And this was just the latest chapter. Further investigation revealed that they weren't part of a larger criminal network, but rather individuals who had learned to live outside the boundaries of society, rejecting rules and morals altogether. Their relationship, marked by mutual dependency, was at the center of the chaos. In interviews, both Tejada and Alston revealed chilling indifference to Nadia's death. They expressed little to no remorse for their actions, and in some cases, appeared almost detached from the severity of the crime. This was not the reaction of two frightened individuals caught up in a moment of panic. Instead, it was the response of two people who had become numb to violence. And then came the question that lingered in the minds of everyone involved. What was their plan after the murder? Did they think they could escape justice by running to Pennsylvania? Or did they genuinely believe they could start a new life? Their flight across state lines had bought them only a few days of freedom, and their eventual capture left many wondering how close they had come to evading justice altogether. In the wake of their arrests, a chilling realization set in. Tejada and Alston were not just criminals on the run. They were deeply troubled individuals who had slipped through the cracks of society and were now willing to commit the most heinous of acts without hesitation. Their story raised questions about the larger issues of youth violence, neglect, and the desperation that can lead people down dark paths. As the case continued to unfold, the chilling truth became clearer. Nadia Vitel's life was cut short not by a random act of violence, but by two young individuals whose destructive tendencies had finally culminated in a crime of unimaginable brutality. What they did to Nadia was unthinkable, but it was also a reflection of a much larger, more troubling issue: the societal failure to intervene before it was too late. In the coming weeks, investigators would uncover even more details about the suspects' lives that would leave the public reeling. But for now, Hallie Tejada and Kensley Alston sat in jail, awaiting their trials, while Nadia's family and friends struggled to come to terms with the horrific crime that had taken their loved one from them forever. The truth was far more complicated than anyone had imagined, and the full story was only just beginning to unfold. Nadia Vitels, a woman simply trying to live her life, was tragically caught in the crosshairs of a senseless act of violence. A mother, a daughter, a friend, Nadia had built a life in New York City, a life that was far from extraordinary, but one filled with moments of peace and contentment. What began as an ordinary day for Nadia ended in a nightmare for her family, friends, and the community that knew her. Her death at the hands of Hallie Tejada and Kensley Alston wasn't just a random tragedy. It was a crime born of desperation, instability, and an unrelenting need for survival that spiraled out of control. The brutal nature of Nadia's murder left many in the city wondering just how far people are willing to go when pushed to the edge. For Nadia, there was no warning. She simply walked in on something she had no control over. She was an innocent bystander in a deadly game she could never have expected. While justice was served with the arrests of Tejada and Alston, the questions linger. How many others have fallen victim to similar acts of violence, their stories never told? We may never know how many people are out there, just as vulnerable, just as unaware, that exist in the shadows of society, ready to commit acts of terror for their own reasons. The lives of countless others may be quietly unraveling, and we can only wonder how many tragedies like Nadia's happen each year, unnoticed. This tragic event serves as a reminder of the dangers lurking in our world, dangers we may not even see until it's too late. The unpredictable nature of human violence is always there, just below the surface, and this case is a chilling example of how quickly an ordinary day can turn into a nightmare. It's easy to feel safe in our routines, but as this story shows, even the most peaceful lives can be shattered in an instant. As we reflect on the case of Nadia Vitels, we are left with a deep sense of loss, a life cut short, and a family forever changed by an act of violence that should never have occurred. It's a painful reminder that no matter where we live or how we try to protect ourselves, we are all vulnerable to the unpredictable forces of violence and rage that can be set into motion by the most unlikely people. We want to hear from you. What do you think led to this horrifying act? Was it sheer desperation, or was there something even darker at play between Hallie Tejada and Kensley Alston? Was this a random crime of opportunity, or was there a deeper, more personal motive? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this case as chilling as we did, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We'll be bringing you more shocking true crime stories from around the world, uncovering the mysteries and tragedies that leave us questioning everything we thought we knew about the people around us. Thank you for watching, and stay safe. If you found this case as disturbing and fascinating as we did, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, click the bell for notifications, and share this video with others who need to hear this chilling story. Check out more of our gripping true crime videos, linked on the screen now. You won't want to miss what's coming next.